Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really important chapter in history,
Hmm.
how people in England tried to fix the problems that came with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah,
That period brought amazing inventions and more stuff than ever before, but well, it also led to some pretty tough situations, especially for the workers.
absolutely. We're talking about difficult, dangerous jobs, really long work days.
Yeah, and crowded, unhealthy living conditions. It sounds grim.
It was for many.
Hmm.
While industrialization was, a period of incredible progress in some ways, it definitely created significant social and economic challenges.
Right. So let's start at the beginning then. What was the main way of thinking about the economy when the Industrial Revolution was just getting started?
Well, that was largely the idea of laissez-faire.
Laissez-faire.
Well,
Right.
think of it like this. Imagine your parents have a completely hands-off approach to, say, your lemonade stand.
Okay.
They don't tell you what price to charge, who you can hire, even if it's your little brother who mostly just, drinks the lemonade,
Ah, right.
or what ingredients to buy. That's kind of what laissez-faire was about for the economy as a whole. The belief was that businesses should operate with as little government interference as possible.
So minimal rules.
Yeah, no heavy regulations, no tariffs. Those are taxes on imported goods, just basically let the market do its thing.
So the government basically thought, let businesses run however they see fit.
Pretty much, yeah. And this idea was really closely connected to the rise of capitalism.
Okay, capitalism. Let's define that simply.
Capitalism, in its simplest form, it's an economic system where most businesses and industries are owned privately.
By individuals or companies.
Exactly. And the main goal is to make a profit. During the Industrial Revolution, the people who owned the factories were operating under this capitalist model. They were driven by the desire to produce more goods and, well, earn more money.
And those laissez-faire policies gave them a lot of freedom to do that, I guess.
A huge amount of freedom in how they ran their operations, yes.
And you can see how that might lead to some of the problems we talked about earlier, right?
Definitely.
If the main goal is profit and there aren't many rules, then things like, I don't know, making sure the workplace is safe or paying decent wages, maybe not the top priority.
Precisely. The relentless pursuit of profit under a system with minimal rules often resulted in really tough working conditions, incredibly long hours, and, frankly, very low pay for the workers.
And child labor, too, you mentioned.
Yes, it was also common to see children working in dangerous jobs because their labor was cheap. It's hard for us to imagine those kinds of conditions now.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of the initial situation. So as these problems became more and more obvious, people started thinking differently about how to organize society. Tell us about utilitarianism.
Right. Utilitarianism is a philosophy that, at its heart, says that actions are right if they tend to promote overall happiness
Okay.
and wrong if they tend to produce unhappiness. The big idea is to aim for the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people.
Greatest good for the greatest number, sort of thing.
That's the common phrase, yeah. Now, this idea, it could be used in some interesting and actually conflicting ways when people looked at the conditions of the Industrial Revolution.
How so? How could it be used differently?
Well, on one hand, some might have argued that even though, yes, some workers were suffering badly,
Mm-hmm.
industrialization as a whole was generating more wealth, producing more goods, which ultimately benefited a larger number of people in society. So by that logic,
The overall happiness went up, even with the suffering.
that was one argument, yes, that the overall happiness might have increased, even if it came at a significant cost to a segment of the population. But then, on the other hand,
Yeah.
critics could strongly argue that the immense suffering of the working class, those long hours, the dangerous conditions, the poverty, meant that the system was clearly failing to provide the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Because the number suffering was so large.
Exactly. They might say that the happiness of a relatively small group of factory owners was coming at the direct expense of the misery of a much larger group of workers. So it became a way to both justify and critique what was happening.
That makes sense. It's like trying to weigh the overall benefits for society against the very real pain experienced by, well, a huge part of that society.
It's a tough calculation,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Now, what about utopianism? It sounds like a more direct attempt to just escape the bad stuff.
Utopianism was definitely a response to the harsh realities of industrial society. Utopians were basically trying to imagine and sometimes even create ideal communities.
Like perfect little towns.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Places where the big problems of industrial life, Things like poverty, inequality, that feeling of being disconnected or alienated would just be eliminated.
How would they do that?
These were often small, experimental communities built on principles like cooperation and shared resources. The idea was to create a better way of life for the people within those communities, almost like a little bubble, an escape from the industrialized world.
And maybe show others it could work.
Exactly, and demonstrate that a different way was possible.
So these were people actively trying to build their own version of a perfect society, like literally build it.
Precisely. They believed that by setting up these model communities, they could show the world a better way to organize things and maybe, just maybe, inspire larger changes in society as a whole.
Wow, did it work?
It was a very hopeful movement, but, well, often unsuccessful in the long run. Many of these communities didn't last.
Interesting. Okay, and then we get to socialism, which sounds like a more fundamental challenge to the whole capitalist system itself.
It really is. Socialism is an economic and political system where the community or the state, rather than private
Like
individuals,
the factory owners we talked about.
exactly, instead of them, the community or the state has ownership and control over the main ways of producing goods, things like factories, land, what are often called the means of production.
Okay, so collective ownership.
That's the idea. Socialists argue that this kind of collective ownership would lead to a fairer distribution of wealth and resources. And crucially, it would get rid of the exploitation of workers that they saw as just built into capitalism.
Because they looked at the inequality.
Yes, they looked at the huge inequalities of the Industrial Revolution. The very wealthy factory owners living right alongside the very poor workers and said, this is a direct result of private ownership and that relentless drive for profit.
So instead of individual business owners, maybe the workers themselves or the government would own and run the factories and other industries. Is that the basic idea?
That's the core idea, yes. The goal was to prioritize the needs of society and the workers over the accumulation of private profit.
Okay. And this leads us to Karl Marx.
It does. He was an incredibly important thinker in the development of these socialist ideas. You hear his name come up a lot, right?
We definitely do. So what was his main contribution to this way of thinking? What did Marx add?
Well, Karl Marx made a really detailed analysis of capitalism. He argued that it was inherently unequal.
Inherently, like by its very nature.
Yes, and that it would always lead to the exploitation and alienation of the working class. He believed that history was basically a long series of struggles between different social classes.
Okay.
And that under capitalism, the bourgeoisie, that's the class that owns the factories and other means of
The
production,
owners,
they
yeah.
would always take advantage of the proletariat.
The working class.
The working class. Exactly. Marx predicted that this conflict, this class struggle, would eventually lead to a socialist revolution.
A revolution.
Yes, where the workers would overthrow the capitalist system entirely and create a much more equal society.
Wow. And this is where the idea of communism comes in, right? How does that fit?
Yes. Communism, at least as envisioned by Marx, is a specific type of socialism. It's kind of seen as the final stage, the ultimate goal in societal development after socialism.
The final stage. Okay.
In a communist society, the idea is that the means of production are owned communally by everyone. There's no private property at all.
No private property.
None. And eventually the theory goes there would be no social classes and even no need for a government or state.
No government.
It's this vision of a stateless, classless society organized around the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need.
Okay, that is a very radical idea about how society could be organized. A huge shift.
A very big shift in thinking, yes.
So moving away a bit from these like grand philosophical and economic ideas, let's talk about how the workers themselves tried to improve their daily lives and working conditions. That's where unions come in, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's crucial. As individual workers, they had very, very little power to ask for better wages or safer working conditions.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. If one worker complained, they could just easily be fired and replaced. There were plenty of people desperate for work.
Right. One person doesn't have much leverage.
Exactly. So they realized that they had much more power when they joined together. That's why they formed unions.
Okay, so define a union for us.
Unions are basically organizations of workers who band together to protect their shared rights and interests. The basic idea was strength in numbers. By acting as a group, they would have much more leverage when dealing with their employers.
Like a sports team, one player can't usually win a game on their own.
But a united team has a much better chance. That's a good analogy.
Strength in numbers, basically. Okay. And how did these unions try to achieve their goals? Better pay, better conditions.
They used a few key methods.
Yeah.
One really important one was collective bargaining.
Collective bargaining. What's that?
This involves negotiations between the employers and the union, which is representing all the workers in that union.
Ah, okay.
So instead of each worker trying to negotiate their own wage or hours, which we said was pretty ineffective,
Right.
the union would negotiate on behalf of all its members for things like better pay, shorter working hours, and safer working conditions.
So instead of one worker timidly going in and asking for a raise, the union, speaking for everyone, sits down with the factory owner.
Yeah, exactly. This gave the workers a much, much stronger voice.
Makes sense. What else? You mentioned strikes earlier.
Yes, another powerful tool that unions used was the strike. A strike is basically a work stoppage.
Everyone just walks out.
Pretty much. The employees collectively refuse to work, usually as a form of protest, often after negotiations haven't gone anywhere.
Why would they do that?
It was a way for the workers to put direct economic pressure on the factory owners. If nobody's working, nothing's getting produced.
And the owner isn't making any profit.
Exactly. It cuts right into their profits.
I can imagine that would be a pretty effective tactic if enough workers participated.
It definitely could be very effective, yes.
Yeah.
But it also came with significant risks for the workers themselves.
Like what?
Well, for one, if they weren't working, they weren't getting paid.
Yeah, that's tough.
Very tough. And employers often resisted unions and strikes very strongly, sometimes violently. It could lead to serious conflicts.
Okay, so we have these worker efforts, these union actions, alongside all these different social and economic theories floating around. But eventually the government started to get involved too, right? By passing actual laws.
Yes, that's the third piece of the puzzle, government intervention.
Let's talk about some of those key laws, starting with the Factory Act of 1833. What was that about?
The Factory Act of 1833 was a really significant law passed in England. It specifically aimed to improve the, frankly, terrible conditions faced by children working in factories,
Especially textile factories.
particularly in the textile industry, yes.
Yeah.
It brought in several key changes. For instance, it made it illegal to employ children under the age of 9 in these factories.
Under 9, wow.
Yes. And it also set limits on how long older children could work. Kids between 9 and 13 couldn't work more than 8 hours a day.
8 hours. Still sounds like a lot for a 9-year-old.
It does to us, but it was a reduction. And for young people between 13 and 18, their working hours were limited to no more than 12 hours a day.
12 hours. So this was a direct response to that huge problem of very young children working incredibly long hours in dangerous places.
Absolutely. It was a clear recognition that children were particularly vulnerable and needed protection from the worst abuses of the factory system.
Anything else in that act?
Interestingly, yes. The act also included a requirement that children working in factories should receive some basic education.
Really? Schooling, too?
Some schooling, yes, which was another important step forward, trying to provide something beyond just labor.
That does sound like a step in the right direction, definitely. What came after that? You mentioned the Mines Act.
Right, the Mines Act. Now, our current information doesn't specify the exact year, but we know its main goal was to address the horrifying working conditions in coal mines.
Which were notoriously bad, right?
Unbelievably dangerous and unhealthy. One of its most important provisions was that it prohibited women and young children from working underground in the mines. At all.
Banned them completely from going underground.
Yes.
That must have made a huge difference. I mean, considering how incredibly dangerous and unhealthy those conditions were.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially for women and children in those cramped, dark, dusty spaces.
It was a significant change. Coal mines were extremely dangerous places. Constant risks of explosions, cave-ins, terrible lung diseases from breathing in coal dust, poor air quality.
Just awful.
Awful. So banning women and young children from working underground was a major step towards reducing some of the most severe forms of exploitation and danger in that industry.
Okay. And then finally, we have the 10 Hours Act of 1847. What did this law achieve?
The 10 Hours Act of 1847 further restricted working hours in factories. This time it focused specifically on women and young people, those under the age of 18.
Okay, so building on the earlier Factory Act,
Exactly. It limited their workday to a maximum of 10 hours per day.
10 hours max for women and young people.
That was the limit, yes.
So this law further reduced those incredibly long working hours, at least for these groups of workers.
Yes, precisely. And while it didn't directly regulate the working hours of adult men,
It didn't.
not directly in the law itself, no,
Hmm.
but in practice, it often had a wider impact. Well, because many factories relied heavily on the labor of women and young people. Limiting their hours sometimes forced adjustments in the overall factory schedule for everyone.
Ah, I see. Sort of a knock-on effect.
Exactly. So it was another important victory in the long movement for shorter working hours and improved working conditions for a significant portion of the workforce.
Okay. Wow. So we've looked at a lot of different angles here. We've got the economic and philosophical ideas that were around.
Laissez-faire, capitalism, utilitarianism, utopianism, socialism, communism.
Yeah.
Then the ways the workers themselves tried to organize and fight for better conditions through unions.
Collective bargaining, stripes.
And finally, the government stepping in with specific laws to regulate things, like the Factory Acts and Mines Act.
Right.
So what's the big picture here? What should we take away from all of this?
I think the main thing to understand is that all of these different approaches and reforms, the ideas, the worker actions, the laws, were fundamentally responses.
Response to what? To the serious social and economic problems that were created by industrialization in England. You had these new ways of thinking about the economy and society popping up.
Because the old ways weren't working for everyone.
Exactly. You had workers organizing to demand better treatment because the initial conditions were just so harsh.
Mm.
And eventually you had government intervention trying to correct some of the worst abuses, particularly when it came to child labor and the sheer length of the working day.
It really sounds like there was a real push and pull, doesn't it? Between like the idea of letting businesses operate freely to generate wealth.
The laissez-faire capitalist drive.
Yeah, and the growing understanding that there was a significant human cost to that kind of unchecked economic growth.
Precisely. These efforts, whether they came through intellectual arguments or the actions of workers on the ground or government legislation, they really represented a shift.
A shift in thinking.
A definite shift in how people thought about the economy and the role of government. It was a move away from a purely hands-off, laissez-faire approach towards recognizing that, actually, there might be a need for regulation.
And for protecting people.
And for the protection of the rights and the basic well-being of workers. The debates and the changes that happened during this period really laid the groundwork for many of the labor laws and social safety nets that we see in place in many parts of the world today.
It's really eye-opening, actually, to see how these early struggles and the ideas that came out of them still influence how we think about work and the economy and fairness in society even now.
Absolutely. The challenges of balancing economic progress with social well-being, they're still very much with us. And looking back at how people in the Industrial Revolution tried to address these issues, it gives us really valuable context for the debates we're still having today.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into, yeah, a pivotal period in history. Now, for you, our listeners, especially those of you between, say, 14 and 16, let's do a quick check to see what you've picked up.
Yeah, let's see. Think about these questions. First, what were some of the major problems that workers faced during the Industrial Revolution in England? Can you list a few?
Second, can you explain the basic ideas behind laissez-faire and socialism? Like, how were their approaches to the economy really different?
Third, why did workers find it necessary to form unions? What was the point? And what were some of the main tools, the methods they used to try and improve their working conditions?
Good one. Fourth, what were the key goals of the Factory Act of 1833 and the 10 Hours Act of 1847? What specific problems were those laws trying to solve?
And finally, maybe a bigger picture question. Can you think of any ways that these historical debates about the economy, about workers' rights, the role of government, are still relevant? Are they still being discussed in the world around you today?
That last question is a really important one to think about, isn't it? And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. In our world today, how do we continue to try and balance that desire for economic growth and progress with the need to ensure the well-being and fair treatment of all members of society? And what lessons can we actually learn from the way people grappled with these same issues way back during the Industrial Revolution? It's definitely something worth pondering. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.